Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Dublin, which is very appropriate, in fact, because this evening I'm going to be talking to you about two very famous Dublin-born writers, Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker, and also Bram Stoker's most famous creation, Dracula, and the connection between Bram and Oscar when it comes to the writing of Dracula. But in fact, I'm going to broaden my talk out, and I'm going to speak about Bram Stoker's connection with other members of the Wilde family, which was closer, in fact, than his relationship with Oscar. And we can see here Oscar Wilde, who's on the top left hand of the picture. Below him is his brother Willie Wilde. And then on the right-hand side, Oscar's mother, Lady Wilde, Jane Wilde, who was also known as Speranza in Dublin, and she was a very celebrated poet. And below her is her husband, Sir William Wilde, an eminent doctor, but also a folklorist, a historian, and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. If we turn our attention first to the relationship between Bram and Oscar, well, they were contemporaries to some extent when they lived in Dublin as young men. Both studied at Trinity College in Dublin, and you can see a lovely photograph there of Trinity on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, very much looking today as it did when the two young men attended. But Bram was 7 years older than Oscar, and while he attended Trinity for 2 years, from 1865 to 1867, he then accepted a full-time job in the civil service, and his attendance was sporadic from then on. He did graduate with a BA. Oscar entered the university in 1871, and Bram was still involved to quite a large extent. He was very active in two of the college's most prominent societies, the Historical Society and the Philosophical Society, and in fact he reached the highest position in both, president of one and auditor of the other. But Oscar, although he was a member of both societies, rarely participated in any of the debates or events that were held. Now, Bram was also connected to the Wilde family because he was a very regular visit to their home at 1 Merrion Square, a very impressive house, a very short distance away, in fact, from the university, just a short walk. He was there for Christmas in 1875. And he was particularly close, in fact, to Oscar's mother, Jane, who admired him greatly and who often compared him, not very favourably in Oscar's case, to her son. And there's a quote here from one particular letter which Jane Wilde writes to her son Oscar when Bram has been offered, or he's in the running for a promotion in the civil service, quite a good job there, and she writes a letter suggesting that she feels that he will get the job because he never gets into debt and his character is excellent. So perhaps a bit of tension there between the two men because Jane admires Bram so much and sees him as very steady and would like her son to emulate him in some ways. Now, if we look at the closest area of connection really between the two writers, was the fact that they were both involved with the same young woman, a young woman called Florence Balcombe. And she arrived in Dublin when she was 17 years of age, when her father, who was a military man, was posted in the city. And they lived close to where Bram had been born, in the same street, in fact, in Clontarf in Dublin. Oscar somehow was introduced to this young girl and was really smitten by her. She was very beautiful. And he formed a relationship with her and they went out on several occasions. He, in a letter to one of his friends, described her as a very beautiful young girl and described the time he spent with her as 2 sweet years, the sweetest of all the years of my youth. That was in a letter to Florence herself, in fact, at the end of their relationship. Now, what was quite extraordinary was that Bram ended up marrying Florence Balcombe on the 4th of December 1878. Oscar was away at the time. He had been accepted into Oxford University in Magdalen College, and while he had been very attentive to Florence in the early days of their relationship, his interest appeared to be waning. He wasn't coming home to Dublin as often as he had been in the past, and while they communicated by letter, and he wrote quite a bit of poetry that had been very much influenced by her, he just seemed to have maybe more of an idealised romantic relationship with her and not a very practical relationship. And she was a young girl with few prospects. She saw Bram perhaps as a very steady, reliable husband, and she became engaged to him and they married very shortly afterwards. In fact, they married a year earlier than they had planned to. And the reason for that was that Bram had accepted a very different new job, an entirely new career, because he had agreed to become the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London. He had become very closely involved with Henry Irving, the principal actor at the theatre, and he had agreed to become the general manager of the theatre. So the newlywed couple, moved to London, and Oscar seemed really quite disappointed and devastated by this, and he saw it as somewhat of a betrayal on Florence's part, the fact that she had formed this relationship behind his back, as he saw it. He had given her some gifts. He'd given her a beautiful watercolour he painted. He had himself, in fact, made this pencil sketch of her that we see here on this slide, and he had given her a tiny gold crucifix with his name on it, and he in fact demanded this back and said that he would keep it with him for the rest of his life. Shortly afterwards, he himself moved to London, in fact, and he was always in close communication with the couple. In fact, himself and his wife, Constance, who he married shortly afterwards, would have had a friendly but not terribly close relationship with the couple, where they went to each other's houses. Oscar would have attended the Lyceum Theatre very often. He sent Bram and Florence copies of his books, very often inscribed to Florence, in fact, and he attended their dinners and her Sunday gatherings that she hosted. And in turn, Bram also attended Oscar and Constance's at-homes, and Bram and Florence would have gone along to Oscar's first nights. They were both there for the opening night of Lady Windermere's Fan, for instance. I've taken a quote here at the top of the page out of Bram Stoker's journal, which was published quite recently, and provides some insights into how he wrote his books and how he came up with some of his more macabre ideas, really. He was a lovely man, a very nice, very friendly man. Everybody who met him testifies to that. But he clearly had a very dark side to his imagination. And he jots down an idea for a story that may, in fact, have been in some way suggested to him by his relationship with Florence and with Oscar, and he describes the situation of a seaport where two sailors love the same girl, one marries her and the other swears revenge. And in a very macabre twist, the husband goes out to sea soon after the marriage, and on return, after some days, sees in grey light of morning his young wife crucified on the great cross which stands at the end of the pier. Very chilling. And the use of the idea of the crucifix and the cross, perhaps something suggestive of the cross that Oscar had given to Florence. Now, there's a very interesting couple of letters here, one from Oscar to Bram Stoker and the other from Oscar to Ellen Terry, in fact, but it concerns Florence. So in the letter to Bram Stoker, which was sent about 1880, which means that Oscar would have been about 25 or 26 years old, very newly arrived in London. We can date the letter because of the address he uses, which is 13 Salisbury Street, and that was where he lived when he arrived in London from Oxford very early on. And it's quite a distant letter, really. He addresses Dear Stoker, and he's looking for a favour. He's looking for theatre tickets for the Lyceum that night. He's pretty disorganised. He hasn't got them, and he's clearly promised some friends that he'll have tickets to the theatre. So he asks if Bram could find him a seat. He'd be very much obliged. It's really quite perfunctory, nothing very warm in it. But then very shortly afterwards, perhaps only weeks afterwards, in fact, on the 3rd of January 1881, he writes a letter to Ellen Terry, he's become very friendly with her at that stage. She would have been one of the leading actresses in London, and this is a very important alliance that he has, and a genuine friendship that he has with this woman. And he writes to her, "My dear Nellie, here are some flowers for you, 2 crowns of flowers, one for herself, and the other," he writes, "don't think me treacherous, please give to Florrie from yourself. I should like to think that she was wearing something of mine the first night she comes on stage, that anything of mine should touch her. She thinks I never loved her, thinks I forget. My God, how could I?" So he's going behind Bram's back to some extent here and still trying to maintain this closeness, this romantic relationship with Bram's wife Florence, who was previously his girlfriend, which shows a tension in the relationship there. Something that's quite interesting. It's unclear as to whether Bram was ever aware of this letter or whether in fact Florence was ever aware of this letter, but she perhaps almost certainly received that crown of flowers, and wore it perhaps on stage when she appeared in the play that night. So I think that suggests to you that there was something quite unusual in the relationship between the couples, an underlying tension relating from the previous relationship between Oscar and Bram's wife Florence.
So an unusual rivalry. Now, to turn our attention then to a closer friendship, really, in the Wilde family, Bram Stoker was really quite close and quite friendly with Willie Wilde, Oscar's older brother by 2 years. And that's because really Willie was very active in the same societies as Bram Stoker in Trinity College. So Willie was on the council of the FIL, and you can see him listed there in the list of council members. He also spoke very regularly at debates, and in fact they would have often spoken on the same card, I suppose. So it's quite interesting to see, if you see the Thursday the 4th of May there, they were discussing Walt Whitman's essay, Bram Stoker being a particular fan and aficionado of Walt Whitman. And you can see Mr. A. Stoker, ex-president, is there, and Mr. William Wilde. Further down then, again, you have Stoker and Wilde speaking on the same night. And 2 other examples, and that's just a selection of examples from a whole series of events that they would have attended together and spoken at together. So they got to know each other very well at university, but they maintained that friendship. Willie Wilde also left Trinity College with a BA, and he was called to the bar, in fact, in Dublin, but he never practiced law. He moved over to London with his mother, and he mostly worked as a journalist. And for a time, actually, both men lived quite close together in Chelsea. They were both involved in the Irish Literary Society, and they kept up a very warm correspondence throughout their lives. So if we look, for example, at one letter that's on file in the FOLKLORE Shakespeare Library, it's addressed from Bram Stoker to my dear Willie, and that's on the 31st of December, 1889. And then there's a most extraordinary letter, really, that Willie Wilde sends to Bram Stoker from his address at 146 Oakley Street. And that's sent in July 1895, just after Oscar was convicted and imprisoned. And he writes a very warm language, really, Bram, old friend. Poor Oscar was not as bad as people thought him. He was led astray by his vanity and conceit, and he was so got at that he was weak enough to be guilty of indiscretions and follies, that is all. He is taking his punishment with manly fortitude, and from my heart I believe that this thing will help to purify him body and soul. I'm sure you and Florence must have felt the disgrace of one who cared for you both sincerely. I would like to talk to you. Funny to suggest that they might feel disgrace. So I suppose that raises some interesting questions, because there isn't much really coming from Bram's side of the relationship. We don't have any indication as to how he responded. Did they meet and talk? But there is a story that came into circulation, and actually that was sourced from Anne Stoker, who was Bram Stoker's granddaughter, and she suggested that Bram had at one time travelled to Paris to bring money to Oscar after he'd been released from prison. There's no other source of information on that potential meeting. It just comes from this woman, Anne Stoker, and she says that it came directly from her own mother, who would have been Bram's daughter-in-law, married to his son Noel. So intriguing, really. The third relationship then in the Wilde family with Bram Stoker was between Bram and Sir William Wilde. Sir William was very well regarded in Dublin society. He was a historian, amateur historian, as well as being a very eminent medical doctor, and he also collected a lot of folklore, and he was very involved with Trinity College. So he was a dignitary on stage when Bram gave his editorial address when he was appointed auditor of the College Historical Society. He was present when Bram was elected librarian of the society as well. And Bram, when he was in the Wilde home, would very often go to William Wilde's study and take refuge there with a group of other young men, and they would discuss all kinds of things. But one of the stories that Sir William told the gathering on one occasion was the story of the robbery of the Galway mail train in 1840. And that's a story that ties in with Irish rebellion and revolution. And Stoker noted it in his journal, reasonably recently published journal, where he used to jot down a lot of ideas for stories. And one of the stories he told was the account of the Galway mail as told to him by Sir William Wilde. He also put Dr. Wilde directly into one of his books, Into the Snake's Pass, where he actually mentions him and says Dr. Wilde himself, rest his soul, couldn't have put it easier to grip, using some, trying to write there in the Irish vernacular. So obviously a man that he held in very high esteem and high regard. He had a very close relationship with Oscar's mother, Jane. One letter from Bram's father suggests that he dined with her quite often. He says, I suppose you dine with Lady Wilde as usual. In London, they lived very close together, just 5 minutes walk from each other's homes. And he would have quite regularly attended her conversazione in Dublin and her salon in London. And actually, Paul Murray, who wrote a book From the Shadow of Dracula, which is one of the better biographies of Bram Stoker, suggests that the relationship that Stoker writes in a book called The Chain of Destiny, which was serialized in the Shamrock magazine, and it's one of his earlier works from 1875, that the relationship in that book between a man called Frank Stanford and a Mrs. Trevor, and Mr. Trevor as well, in fact, may have been very close to the relationship that he had with the Wilde parents, a constant visitor to their house, growing in their affections, and he speaks of how Mrs. Trevor was almost maternal with him. So there's a suggestion there that might have reflected the relationship he had with Jane Wilde. So that's sort of setting the scene, really, I suppose, to understand where Stoker stands in relation to the Wilde family. And you can see that they really were quite close. As to the question of whether the Wilde family had any influence on Stoker's most famous work, which is Dracula, well, there are really, I suppose, two aspects that I'd like to examine to this question. The first of them is a very modern belief, really quite a recent examination of Dracula, that suggests that Stoker may in part or entirely, in fact, written it in response to Oscar's trials. And that's probably best exemplified in a paper written by Professor Talia Schaffer, who wrote A Wild Desire Took Me, the homoerotic history of Dracula. And that was published in ELH volume 61, number 2, summer 1994, a very, very interesting article, which we'll take a look at in some more detail. And then the second aspect of influence, really, that the Wildes might have had on Dracula was this idea that potentially Stoker took the folklore that he wove into his story of Transylvania from a lot of the Irish folklore that would have been collected by Sir William Wilde and also Lady Wilde and published in her Ancient Legends of Ireland, which came out 10 years before Dracula in 1887. And that has been pioneered mostly, I suppose, understandably by Irish commentators. We would love to think that Dracula was Irish. So I think there's this great desire to find a link between the legends of Dracula and the Irish legends and folklore that we would know so well here. And we'll examine that in some detail as well. So to look then at the first aspect, the idea that in any way the writing of Dracula was in reaction to the three trials, in fact, that Wilde had in the spring and summer of 1895. The theory really would be predicated on the notion that Stoker felt in some way vulnerable about his own sexuality and that he felt threatened by his association with Wilde as a result. And there has, in fact, been persistent speculation about Stoker's sexuality. There's this sort of pervading belief that his marriage wasn't terribly successful and that the couple weren't terribly close. Now, I actually don't entirely subscribe to that because there isn't really any evidence. Stoker didn't leave a lot of biographical information, so there's a bit of a vacuum and that tends to get filled, I think, with a lot of speculation. But he seems to have had quite a loving relationship with Florence. They led quite separate lives. He was very busy in the theatre. That wasn't really of interest to her. But certainly any letters that he left, and he wrote one particular letter, in fact, to his brother, Thornley Stoker, where he praises her because she has nursed him through illness, and he speaks of her as an angel and says how he can't imagine how she possibly managed because she had to deal with the finances of the home and she had to nurse him. He travelled a lot when the Lyceum Theatre went on tour, and they went to America quite often, and it's often said, well, how come she never went with them? But she did in fact travel once, and the reason that she didn't go back was because she had been shipwrecked with their child, Noah, when he was just 7 years old, and she was absolutely terrified of sea travel. But anytime he was away from her, he spoke about how much he missed her, and he would love her to have been there with him. They took holidays together, most notably their holiday in Whitby for 3 weeks. She was there with him, as was Noah. So I think they were closer than perhaps people think. However, there is evidence to suggest that Stoker was very drawn to certain very charismatic men, particularly older men. And the first evidence of that, I suppose, is a letter, a very long, very sincere letter that he wrote to the poet Walt Whitman. And actually the letter has quite an interesting history, because he wrote it 4 years before he actually sent it. He wrote it in 1872 in response to Whitman's book Leaves of Grass, which does contain a lot of homoerotic elements and certainly suggests the potential for men to have very close and loving relationships. And Stoker seemed to respond very much to something in that. So he wrote this letter, but he never sent it. He kept it for 4 years. And then 4 years later, he sent it with a cover letter. And I think one of the most striking passages, and something that he echoes in his journal, is this idea that it's a sweet thing for a strong, healthy man with a woman's eye and a child's wishes to feel that he can speak to a man who can, if he wishes, be father, brother, and wife to his soul. And Stoker is tying into this notion, and we'll see it expressed by other of his contemporaries, this notion that there has to be more possibility to transcend gender. Gender was defined so narrowly back then. Men behaved in a certain way, women behaved in a certain way. There were very separate spheres. And there was this great desire on the part of men and women, of women to have more empowerment and to move out into the more public sphere, but also of men that they could not always have to behave in this very strong manly way, that there was the potential to be something other, to be what they saw almost, I suppose, as a mix of the best of the male, the masculine and the feminine, and that there was almost a sort of a third way to be. And there was this great desire expressed, which is echoed in a lot of what Stoker writes in his private correspondence and in his diary. And then the second example of sort of hero worship, I suppose you'd call it, would be his relationship with Henry Irving, which is very close. And in his own words, he describes himself as an intimate friend, in certain ways the most intimate friend of his life. I knew him as well as it is given to any man to know another. There's one thing I should point to you, actually, in the earlier excerpt there in his letter to Whitman. He says at the end there, the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. And my kind has been subject to a lot of interpretation. What did he mean by his kind? Did he mean poetic men? Did he mean the type of man that he describes earlier on then? Or did he mean homosexual men? You could certainly speculate about his sexuality there. This notion, I suppose, of Dracula and this idea of gender fluidity, it's a more recent idea, really, and it probably was one of the first expressions was by Christopher Kraft in a paper that he wrote called Kiss Me With Those Red Lips, Gender and Inversion in Bram Stoker. And he has some really interesting ideas in there, I think. It's a sort of a psychoanalytical look at Dracula, and he talks about Dracula being fraught with concerns of gender fluidity, that male interactions are what he describes as heterosexualized by passing through a woman, that Dracula problematizes gender rigidity and the idea of compulsory heterosexuality, which have been very much a Victorian notion, and that vampirism in itself is very transformative, that it makes women sexually aggressive and it makes men more nurturing, and it allows opportunity to behave differently from the norm. If you look at some of the contemporaries then of Stoker at the time, there were a couple of men that I've picked out here who were writing very interestingly on the idea of carving out, I suppose, some space for themselves to behave differently. And the first man I'm looking at there is John Addington Symonds, who wrote a book called A Problem in Greek Ethics in 1883. And actually it's interesting that Wilde read Symonds as well, and he reviewed some of his writings and some of his work. Symonds speaks of Greek love as this passionate and enthusiastic attachment subsiding between man and youth. And that echoes a lot of Wilde's thinking and Wilde's writing as well. And he describes these relationships as not being free from sensuality, but that they're not in any way licentious. That there's something to be very much admired. And then we have Edward Carpenter, and he was a very progressive man. He was a socialist, and he was what we, I suppose, could consider to be one of the very early campaigners for gay rights. I mean, he was a sort of a proto-activist in that area. And he talks as well of this possibility, this great opportunity to have what he describes as a balance of the feminine and masculine qualities, that you could in fact have people that were great interpreters, as he describes them, of men and women to each other, if you were allowed to have people who could combine these traits. And I think it's actually a very progressive type of language that they're using, and they're trying to carve out this space for themselves, I suppose, to behave outside the very rigid norms that were set at the time. And then you can see that echoed again in Bram Stoker's writing, because in his journal, his private journal, which was recently published, he again echoes this sentiment that was in the letter to Walt Whitman, where he says, "Will men ever believe that a strong man can have a woman's heart and the wishes of a lonely child?" If we look then at Dracula and Stoker's life, I just picked out what I thought was quite an interesting little comment from something called the Frankenpod, which is an Australian podcast, as far as I understand it, that looks at Gothic literature and cinema. And I thought it was quite interesting that they discuss how many people read Jonathan Harker, the character in Dracula's, time at the Count's castle as a homoerotic experience of temptation. And then they also talk about Jonathan Harker's life with Mina Murray, who he marries as the novel goes on, as being sort of relatively sexless, which sort of echoes the belief that people have about Stoker's own marriage with Florence. And he also they also talk about how Harker is able to exist in London with his male friends and his family life in harmony, and the duality of domestic sphere and then this homosexual social sphere, which again sort of has echoes of Stoker's life and his life with the Lyceum Theatre and his very close bond with Irving. So I thought that was quite interesting when we look at this idea of duality and transition, particularly in the light then again of the Wilde trials, which really threw a bit of a hand grenade into the whole situation, because I think there was this tenuous attempt to carve out these different ways of living. And then when Oscar Wilde took the libel trial and then ultimately ended up on trial himself for gross indecency, well, this just exploded the whole thing wide open, and there was again this terrible condemnation and awful rejection of any idea of having a different way of living, a different way of life. I think it's quite interesting, there's a picture there of Ellen Terry, who was the lead actress in the Lyceum Theatre. And she had a very close relationship with Stoker. They worked very closely together, but she called him Ma. And a lot of the other women who were connected with the Lyceum Theatre referred to him as Mother or Mama Stoker in a very affectionate way, because he looked after them and because he looked after a lot of the things that needed doing. But again, perhaps sensing that they saw something in him that was nurturing and feminine, as they would have seen it, that they gave him in these names. And then I've just added in at the bottom there the idea, again reflecting, I suppose, Dracula's life and Stoker's real life, the idea of a love triangle, that you could describe in a sense the relationship between Dracula and Mina Murray and Jonathan Harker as being a love triangle, because Dracula desired Mina Murray, and he did in fact bite her several times, as we know, and contaminate her with his blood, and have a hold over her, and she then was connected to him in a way almost, I suppose, that you could see Oscar Wilde being connected with her throughout her life. And then there's Bram and Florence and Oscar, but there's also a further love triangle actually in another book called The Snake's Pass, where you have a lead character called Arthur Severn, and he falls in love with a local peasant girl called Nora, but she is engaged to be married to his friend Dick. And in fact, he expresses his hope that Dick will give her up and not complain about it and allow him to form a relationship with her. So there are these echoes. To turn our attention then to Professor Schaffer's work, which I think is really interesting and takes things a bit further then and looks directly at Dracula as a response to Wilde and to Wilde's trials. And she describes, I've just picked out some quotes here and put the page numbers in. She says that Dracula explores Stoker's fears as a closeted homosexual. You would have to assume that he was writing as a closeted homosexual man. During the trial, she suggests that Stoker erased any mention of Wilde's name from his published and unpublished texts. He certainly doesn't mention the Wilde family very much in any of his writings. She sees Dracula as being structured by the anguishing choice between repressed helplessness and dangerous action. She suggests Wilde as a vampire who stalks the margins of Stoker's texts and who kind of hovers behind all of his writings on sexuality. And she talks again of this idea of transcendence, that you have to almost explore something in its full in order to reconcile with it and then transform it into something viable. Dracula, she says, represents not so much Oscar himself as the complex of fears and desires and secrets and repressions and punishments that his name evoked, and certainly his name did evoke all of that from 1895 onwards. And so in Dracula, then she suggests that Stoker is simultaneously exploring Wilde as a monster, but also sympathizing and identifying with the real Wilde as he knew him and with his plight. And I think it's quite interesting. We looked at that letter earlier on that Oscar's brother Willie sent to Bram Stoker, where he talks about how this thing, as he describes it, will help to purify him body and soul. And you do find echoes of that in the text of Dracula, where I've just picked out one quote here: "Just think what will be his joy when he too is destroyed in his worst part, that his better part may have spiritual immortality." This idea of, I suppose, being punished and purified and coming back as something better. So there are some interesting echoes there. It's quite interesting to look at some of the contemporary descriptions of Oscar Wilde at the time of his trial and afterwards, and also to look at some of the text from Dracula. So we have here a description of Dracula from page 51, where he's described as bloated, a filthy leech, that he was revolting. Now, Frank Harris, who's quoted there in the second piece of text, was a friend of Oscar Wilde. You could say with friends like that, who means enemies. But he describes Oscar, he's a very flowery writer, very colourful, not terribly reliable. But he says there was something oily and fat about him that repelled him. His skin was bilious and dirty. His appearance filled me with distaste. It's very similar language. The newspapers at the time went all in as well, and they spoke about corruption. And it's quite interesting, the language that they use is very reminiscent of the sort of language in Dracula. So you've got the idea that Wilde wasn't fit. He was only fit for an environment of artificial light and secret chambers where the light of day couldn't get in, not fresh air and not sunshine. That's very reminiscent of some of the imagery in Dracula. And I've just picked out a comment there where Sheffer says that the judge in the case called Wilde the centre of this hideous circle of corruption. So you can see some of the echoes in the language there between what was being reported about Wilde and the text of Dracula. There is a problem, however, with timing. Now, it's very possible that Stoker had this idea and he sketched it out, but that he may have modified the writing of the book after or in the light of Wilde's trial. But Schaffer, certainly in her article, suggested that he began Dracula 1 month after Wilde's conviction for gross indecency, which was in May 1895. But in fact, he had made notes very early on. In fact, he'd made notes in 1890, having completed his novel, The Snake's Pass, and he'd sketched out more or less the full plot by 1892. And we know that because the notes came to light. They were sold by Florence Stoker at auction after her husband's death, and they're now held in the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. And they're a wonderful resource, and they've been published in Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula. You can see the cover of it there, very interesting book. This also is a bit of a retrospective analysis, so we're sort of imposing notions, very modern notions and ideas onto Stoker's motivations and assuming what his motives are. And certainly Barbara Belford, who is one of Bram Stoker's biographers, suggests that at the time readers certainly found nothing sexually unsettling about Dracula. There's a letter there from Arthur Conan Doyle, who's actually a very close friend of Bram Stoker's, and Stoker was at his wedding, in fact, to show you how close they were. And they collaborated on a number of projects, and they wrote a chapter each of a book that was serialized. And they quite often spoke to each other about each other's work. So Stoker was a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, for instance. And in this letter, it certainly seems like Arthur Conan Doyle took the book very much at face value, and he describes it as a very exciting diabole, and certainly mentions nothing about any sexual content there. Bram Stoker himself sent a copy to William Gladstone, and he says that there was nothing in it that should in any way be unsettling. It's just the story of an old vampire as far as he was concerned. And I think it's interesting to look then at a quote from Jarlath Killeen, who is Dr. Jarlath Killeen of Trinity College Dublin, who teaches in Victorian literature. And he put together, edited a very interesting collection of essays on the centenary of Bram Stoker there in 2014. And he discusses how we always sort of assume that Stoker was this collection of neuroses. And we need to really put that into perspective. Certainly people who knew him spoke of him as being a very easygoing, kind, friendly, very engaging man. He didn't seem to be a bundle of neurosis to them. And he also suggests that Victorians were perfectly capable of recognising what he calls a pornographic novel, but certainly sexual content in a novel. And in fact, some of Stoker's later work does have quite for the time, graphic sexual detail in it. So they certainly were well able to recognise that in their literature. So to turn then to the second influence that potentially the Wilde family had on Dracula, and that's the idea that Lady Wilde in particular, and her book of Ancient Legends of Ireland, which was produced in 1887 in 2 volumes, provided some of the source material really for some of the legends, that the Irish legends were taken and adapted for Transylvania. And she particularly mentions the fact that Transylvanian legends are very similar to Irish legends. She draws on an article written by a Scottish folklorist called Emily Gerard, published in the 19th century. And she says that many are identical to the Irish, particularly that the dead are only in a trance, that they can hear everything but make no sign. And she elaborates there. I've just put the full quote, there's no need to read all of it, but just to pick out some of the highlights. She speaks about how the Irish believe that the dead are allowed at certain times to visit their living kindred. But she then says particularly that the Romanians have a darker and a gloomier set of superstitions, and mentions in particular vampires and evil spirits and witches. And she says that Irish people do more with fairies, although our fairies are usually quite malevolent, in fact. But that possibly sparked off the idea that Stoker, who grew up with a good immersion in Irish folklore, could maybe adapt some of that to write about Transylvania and Romania. And that probably that notion is pioneered most strongly by Paul Murray in his book. He says as much in Lady Wilde's work that anticipates the world of Dracula. He speaks about blood being a recurring theme, the horned women being very like the women who are enthralled to Dracula. Images I have there of the image of the stolen child appears quite often in Irish folklore. And of course we have the scene, the very shocking scene in Dracula, where the woman is banging on the castle door shouting, "Monster, give me back my child." I've just picked out some small examples here of where there could be things that are in Lady Wilde's book that are also echoed in Dracula. So the idea of the evil eye, and that the peasants are very frightened and that they recognize people as having the evil eye. In the Irish book, in the Ancient Legends, it's suggested that's by their eyebrows being dark and lowering. And then we have in Dracula this idea of the crowd around the inn door and using their charms to ward off the evil eye. Now, yes, they're obviously appearing in both books, but it has to be said that the evil eye is quite a common, recurring trope in a lot of legend and myth from lots of different countries. So it's potentially just a tenuous link and quite coincidental. And the idea of the evil eye is very closely associated with Romanian folklore. So Stoker may well have got it directly from source. Another thing that I noticed that appeared quite often on close reading is this idea of a blue light hovering over where there was buried treasure. And certainly Lady Wilde in her book mentions this quite often, the appearance of this blue light and the fact that it indicates that there's treasure there. And there's that scene with the coach driver who is Dracula, obviously taking Harker along and then stopping and leaping out and marking spots where he sees blue flames. And then later Dracula says, oh yes, that's because buried treasure will be found there. But again, it has to be said that this is really quite a common trope. And in fact, there are Cornish legends talking about miners seeing blue light where there's a particularly rich seam of gold. There are German incidences of something very similar. And you'll really find quite a few, particularly actually in Scandinavian literature, this idea of the will-o'-the-wisp, sort of guiding people away from safety as they're chasing after this potential for buried treasure. And again, this is a Romanian legend, the idea that on St. George's Day, treasure is buried, blue flame marks it, and you can only actually dig it up if you see the blue flame. There are similarities again in some of the descriptions of the dead. So Lady Wilde speaks of the stolen bride, lifting the cloth from the face of a corpse to see the form of a very beautiful young girl, apparently not dead, but in a deep sleep. That sort of echoes the description of Lucy in Dracula. And then Lady Wilde points to the fact that there are very many strange superstitions concerning the dead, that they have an actual presence, that they that you can feel this great sense of dread when they're around. And this idea that again ties back to the Dracula traveling in a coffin filled with earth and soil from where he belongs, that Irish people don't rest easy unless they're in their own earth. So, you know, you can see some echoes then that potentially sparked his thinking when he was writing Dracula. blood comes up a lot in her work. Mist comes up a lot, the idea of people materializing out of the mist. And that's something that's very common in Dracula as well. And that seems to be something that perhaps is more in Irish legend than in other legends. I'm not a folklore expert by any means, but it seems to crop up a lot in Irish legend. It's probably just because we have very misty weather and no more than that. But certainly you can see echoes in that of people materializing out of the mist, and the mist being a curtain almost between the other world and other realms. The idea of dogs and howling dogs and witches, I think it's very interesting in The Fairy Race when Lady Wilde talks about the witches becoming tools of the evil one. And that very much echoes the ghostly women, the weird sisters in Dracula being in thrall to the Count. And I picked out one story then from Lady Wilde's anthology because I think it has a really Dracula feel about it when you read it in full. A young man meeting a very dark, elegant gentleman. He's taken back to his castle in the woods. He's offered hospitality. He's seduced by several lovely ladies. He carries a coffin and digs a grave, and then they try to put him into the coffin. So it's a very eerie story and very reminiscent of the kind of imagery from Dracula. And then he wakes up at the end feeling downhearted and all trace of the experience is gone. Stoker was steeped in folklore when he grew up in Ireland. When he was a child, William Wilde produced his Irish popular superstitions book in 1852, but his own mother, Charlotte Stoker, she was quite an influence on him, and she had lived through a cholera epidemic when she was a child, when she was a 14-year-old, and she spoke a lot and wrote a paper, in fact, an unpublished paper about this pestilence that was considered to be supernatural by the people because they didn't understand where it had come from. It stalked the land, it killed thousands of people very quickly. She spoke about how victims bled from their mouths, they were buried alive and had to be retrieved. And Bram did in fact ask for her notes, and he did consult other sources on that epidemic. So perhaps again some of that imagery fed in. But really I think if you were to try and address the question of whether Dracula is Irish or not, he probably isn't. And I think that's best explained by a man called Brian Earls, who wrote for the Dublin Review of Books, a very good essay actually called Blood Relations, very long essay, where he concludes that if you look at Stoker's notes, he doesn't make any reference to Ireland. He does in fact cite his references as being Emily Gerard's work on Romanian superstitions, a book of werewolves that he consulted, and that really there's no evidence as such that he was particularly looking at Ireland. And that actually is echoed very early on in Dracula as well. The superstitions gathered in the horseshoe of the Carpathians. So I don't think we can really claim him, unfortunately. And I think it's worth just at the very end mentioning that Dracula, we completely think of Stoker and Dracula and him being completely overshadowed by this one work. But in fact, when he was alive and actually shortly after his death, it wasn't considered to be particularly remarkable out of all his writings. So there's 3 obituaries here that I picked out. Very crudely, the Irish Times said that none of his works were marked by any originality. They were definitely proven wrong there. But the other 2 in the New York Times and in the London Times say that his chief literary work was actually his reminiscence of Irving, and they don't single out Dracula for any particular praise at all. So we see him very much as Stoker was the author of Dracula and very little else. But at the time, not particularly, it was just another of his books. He was a very, very prolific author. He produced more than 18 books and lots of short stories as well, and other journalistic writings, and he crossed a whole gambit of different genres, from romance to horror, adventure, lots of different things. And he did write autobiographically as well. He wrote a book called The Primrose Path very early on in 1875. A Dublin carpenter, moves to London, works in the theatre, drinks heavily and murders his wife. Very dark, but quite a bit of autobiographical writing in there. He does have a book about Irish lore. So rather than turn to Dracula and see did he put much Irish lore in there, well, he wrote a book called The Snake's Pass, and he doesn't deal with a huge amount of Irish legend and lore in it, in fact, but he does touch on a lot of the serpent lore that Lady Wilde wrote about too, the idea of the king of the snakes and the great worm, which obviously comes up in the lair of the white worm as well. And also in that book, while Lady Wilde would have spoken about fairies abducting young men, he does mention this girl, Nora, and this local warning, the protagonist of the book, that she may be a fairy who's intent on trapping him. And that book is actually set in the west of Ireland, where the Wildes had a holiday home. And then the other book, I think, which might have been influenced by the Wilde family, was a book called The Jewel of the Seven Stars, which is all about Egyptology. Sir William Wilde was a keen Egyptologist who discovered a mummy and brought it back to Dublin. And he potentially might have informed the character of ABEL TRELAWNEY, who was similar in description, in fact, ambitious and fearless, interested in scientific progress, believed that the ancient Egyptians were very progressive. So that's just to broaden things out a little bit beyond Dracula and look at some of the other influences. And that's it from me. Probably went a bit over time, but I just encourage everybody who's watching today to check out the Oscar Wilde Society if you're not a member. Some fantastic publications and explorations of Wilde and his wider circle, including Stoker. And there's a Facebook page, there's a Twitter account, and there's also a YouTube channel. And on that YouTube channel at the moment, you'll find Darcy Sullivan's talk from last week, which was an excellent exploration of Dorian Gray and the comics. And that's me done for today.